Okay guys, this is Unit 4, Segment 4, Cellular Respiration. The one really cool thing about this segment is that you've already learned photosynthesis, and it's awesome because cellular respiration is the exact opposite process. So, the exact opposite equation. Love it. This is 9-1 in your textbook, and it's a whole chapter, but we are going to just skim some main ideas in this, and you will be tested on things that I am stressing in the notes, and I've also starred the items on your task work. So you don't need to know all of the nitty-gritty details, but there are some things that you will need to memorize. As far as vocabulary words, cellular respiration, glycolysis, aerobic, anaerobic, fermentation, and pyruvic acid. Let's start with a little silly. Go ahead and read that. So good. Such a good little funny. Kind of ridiculous. Okay, cellular respiration. It's used by plants and animals. Okay, all eukaryotic cells will go through cellular respiration. This is how we tap into our chemical energy. Where does it happen, you ask? In the mitochondria, within the cells of the eukaryotes. Cellular respiration, you will need to memorize the balanced equation. So C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields 6 carbon dioxides, 6 waters, and energy. You need to know both the chemical formulas as well as the written words. But where does the oxygen come from in this equation? Where does that come from? It's an input into the mitochondria, but where does it come from? It comes from the atmosphere. Okay, what was released by photosynthesis by the plants into the atmosphere is now taken in for respiration. Comes from the atmosphere. Where does this come from? The carbon compound, the glucose. And that's a tricky question, because if you are talking about, you need to know who you're talking about. So if you're talking about an animal, where does this come from? Well, we have to eat it. That comes from the food. That's why we are a heterotroph, because we have to go out and seek the food. But if you're asking about a plant, where does this come from for a plant? Well, the answer is it is a product of photosynthesis. So the plants actually made it themselves. They stashed it away in their tissues. This is a stored form of energy. We talked about that. It's a carbohydrate, macromolecule carbohydrate. It's storing energy. So when the plant needs to grow, okay, or needs to go through active transport, or anything that requires energy, it's going to break this up. And you and I will do the same thing. When we need energy, we'll break up the food, okay? Add a little oxygen to it, and that will give us energy. And as additional products, we will breathe out water and carbon dioxide. So those go out to the atmosphere, okay? Cellular respiration. This is a big slide. You need to write it all down. Okay, the first step, now remember this equation that I just showed you is just like photosynthesis, only it's the opposite equation. There's more to the story. There's a couple of ball games that are happening to create this reaction. So let's talk about the ball games. So glycolysis, go ahead and say that, glycolysis. That is the first step to respiration. And this happens in the cytoplasm, remember the jelly-like material that's inside the cells. And I'm showing you an animal cell and a plant cell because both will go through respiration. And they happen in this light blue area. This glycolysis part happens in the cytoplasm. This is before it hits the mitochondria. So we're already beginning respiration in the cytoplasm. It takes in and breaks down the sugar, the glucose. So part of the reaction that you wrote on the last slide included glucose, C6H12O6. It will take that in the cytoplasm and begin to break it down already. It produces, and you will need to know these numbers, 2 ATP. adenine triphosphate. It will produce two of them in something called pyruvic acid and 2-NADH. Do you remember NADPH from photosynthesis? If you do, you will recall that that was an energy molecule as well as ATP. This, my friends, NADH, is the energy molecule for respiration. So it's missing the P. And maybe you can consider the P as photosynthesis, starts with a P. NADH, missing the P, is required for respiration. So anyways, glycolysis will produce only 2 ATP. That's going to give us a little head start, a little kick start on respiration. And it'll produce pyruvic acid and 2 NADH. Guess where these guys are going? To the next stage, to the next set of reactions. So we'll go into aerobic respiration. So after glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm, there's a fork in the road. The question is there oxygen present? Because if there is, it will continue on through the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, like it's normally supposed to, respiration. These are forms of respiration. If it doesn't, if there's not oxygen in the environment, then it will go through anaerobic. Anaerobic respiration is without oxygen. The an at the prefix means without. So if there's no oxygen, it will go through a process called fermentation. And there's two types of fermentation, and you need to know these. There's lactic acid fermentation, and everybody who has worked out ever in their lives and had sore muscles the next day, you are experiencing what it feels like to have your muscles go through anaerobic respiration. Your muscles will build up something called lactic acid, and it will cause the cramping and the pain the next day after a workout. Microbes in yogurt will also go through this process without oxygen, so fermentation is without oxygen, and it's a form of anaerobic respiration. Alcohol is made by anaerobic fermentation. Yeast and bacteria will break down the juices or the materials, the sugars, and produce alcohol. And that's how that works. So that's without oxygen. Our bodies do make a little bit of it, but we're going to talk more about aerobic. This is with oxygen because we know oxygen is an ingredient in cellular respiration. So in that reaction, so it will continue on from glycolysis and head on through Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. The Krebs cycle happens in the mitochondria. So if you recall, glycolysis, that word you learned in the earlier slide, happens in the cytoplasm. The products of glycolysis, the 2 ATP and the pyruvic acid and the 2 NADH, those will go into the Krebs cycle. So they enter into the mitochondria and they go into the rest of respiration. But it takes in the pyruvic acid that was made by glycolysis, and it takes in the 2 ATP that were made by glycolysis, and it also takes in CO2. I'm sorry, it produces CO2. Geez. It produces CO2. It then goes on into the electron transport chain, and you only need to know what it takes in and what it produces. You don't need to know, all the details about the process, although you can get those details from your book. This too occurs in the mitochondria, and it takes in the O2, takes in the NADH, and it produces 32 ATP. Wow, that's a lot of energy. 32 ATP, and it produces the 6 waters. So overall, photosynthesis is a process that's going to store energy. It's going to make the glucose. It's going to make and store that energy in the form of the glucose. But cellular respiration is going to take that stored energy and release it. So I want you to consider photosynthesis as a storing or making energy, and cellular respiration as releasing energy. I'm going to show you the equations again. With photosynthesis, you have CO2 going in, water going in, and you have energy in. And it's stored in the form of this glucose. This energy is stored in a chemical form. But with respiration, especially aerobic with oxygen, is going to take that glucose and it's going to break it up into its components of CO2 and water and energy out. Produces the energy. This energy, you guys, is going to be used to move. It's being used for me to even speak to you, to make the vibrations of talk, and active transport, right? We'll talk about that too. So those are all the things that are, and more, that we're using this energy for. Who does this? Plants and animals do it. Who does the photosynthesis? Only plants. And that is it, my friends.